Hey everybody, welcome to Lust is Boring, and welcome also those you joining us on Facebook Live or watching later on YouTube. Today we've got Dr. Bob Schuchts, who's the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center out in Florida, doing incredible work at the church right now. We're going to bring him on in just a couple minutes, but before we do, couple of announcements. One, we've got, again, pilgrimage coming up this summer. One to Krakow, Poland, and another one to the Holy Land. And so we'd love to spend a week or two or more with you abroad. So if you're interested in doing that with some friends, some family, you just go to chastity.com/pilgrimage. Check it out. It's an incredible itinerary. I've been to both places before, and it's life-changing. And so take it. I mean, we need a break. 2020's been hard enough as it is. So if you need a little getaway, this would be an awesome opportunity. So check out those two pilgrimages. Also, Hallow. I've been promoting this app for a long time. They're a good sponsor, helps our podcast, but they're always coming out with new stuff. It's one of the things I love about them. And the new thing they just came out with, they now have more than 500 pieces of original curated Catholic worship music. They've got, more contemporary praise and worship. They've got more traditional hymns. They've got Gregorian chant, a little bit for everybody. And so I want to just encourage you, if you haven't already, please try this out for 14 days for free. You just go to hallow.com/lustisboring, or you can just click the link in the show notes, and you get to try the app out for free. It's the #1 Catholic app in the world, in my opinion, for good reason. It's the best one that's out there. Now, if you want to support our show, again, Patreon is the place that you can do that. You just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert. You get early access to all the shows, exclusive content. We send you all kinds of free stuff. If you want to submit questions that you want us to answer live on the show, you can do all that on Patreon. So with all that having been said, today's guest, Dr. Bob Schuchts, let me tell you a little bit about him before we bring him on. He's the founder, as I had mentioned, of the John Paul II Healing Center. He's a nationally renowned speaker. He's an author of several books. Now, Bob spent more than 30 years as a therapist while also teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in marriage and family relationships, human development, applied psychology, marriage and family therapy. He held adjunct professor positions at Florida State University, Tallahassee Community College, and the Center for Biblical Studies in Tallahassee, Florida. He's also taught courses at the Theology of the Body Institute and the Augustine Institute. And so without further ado, Bob, I want to welcome you to the show. So Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Jason, thank you. It's great to be with you.
I'm curious, what led you to start? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I said I just admire the work you and Crystalina are doing and touching a lot of people, including my grandchildren. So thank you.
Oh, it's a blessing to hear that. I know that I've referred many, many people to your work because in all my travels after I give these assemblies, I tell the teens, the college students, hey, if you guys need to hang out and talk afterwards, I'll be here to listen. And I mean, man, the stuff they're going through. I mean, it's hard to even wrap your mind around how much the depth of human suffering that some of these young people are going through. And, seventh graders, let alone college students. Then you wonder why they're doing bad in math class and they're having to process these like massive emotional wounds and they don't even know where to begin. And a lot of them will come to me like, I've never said this to anyone before, and then they just unload. And it's like, my goodness, like, how are you walking upright? Like, how are you functioning in life? And so I'd like to know, I mean, today we're going to dive into all different types of healing questions, but just so we can start with you, like, what led you to found the John Paul II, Healing Center? And what is it that you do as a ministry there on a day-to-day basis for the sake of our listeners?
Yeah, it wasn't something I set out to do. It was work that we were already doing. I was teaching at the Theology of the Body Institute and also working with seminarians and priests. And it was like the two of those things converged. And we started the ministry focused on transformation in the heart of the church. So we want to minister to every part of the church, from bishops down to the person who, just struggles with their faith, everybody in between. And we offer conferences, mostly conferences and resources. Conferences are healing conferences, healing the whole person, restoring the glory, a marriage conference, women's conference, men's conferences. And we do a lot of work still with priests and seminarians, and religious, clergy, deacons. And so our calling is just to help come alongside everybody in the church to bring healing of the deeper areas of their hearts and their whole person, healing the whole person. So we integrate our Catholic faith and the teaching of John Paul II with all the things that we've learned over the years about what do we need to become whole in our person.
Now, one of the things that I encounter often when I meet the young people going through this is like, why bother? Why bother drumming up all that stuff from my past and having to relive those experiences and those memories? And look, I'm just going to tough it out. I'm going to be okay. I just really don't want to go to the problem of unveiling all that stuff. I mean, because if I told somebody, then either my parents would, ground me for 40 years, or it involved this massive internal family drama that I don't want to just blow up. So I'm just going to kind of stuff my stuff, move on with my life. But, if you had to convince somebody, why bother now going to the hard work of healing, and just explain how sometimes the depths of these wounds can even be an impediment to your vocation, not only discovering the vocation, but actually being able to enter into it fully. So what would you say to that person that's just kind of on the fence of look, I know I got some stuff, but man, to go to those deep, dark places, that doesn't seem real appealing to me. I'd rather just kind of grind it out.
Yeah, I think it's a real concern. Somebody's been sexually abused and they bring it up and the whole family's a mess. And so the first thing is just to empathize with the struggle of that. They've kept it buried for a reason. And actually two reasons. One is because it's too painful internally to deal with. And secondly, it's too difficult relationally, whether it's breaking up with a bad relationship or exposing something in the family. So I think that's the first thing, is just being with somebody in the struggle and the fear of that, and then helping them see why they came in the first place. Why did they bring it up in the first place? Because they're suffering so intensely right now, and it does affect them in the present. It affects them in a tremendous way. It's like, why would you want to have an arm if you didn't have an arm? If you're walking around without a full capacity, even though it'd be difficult to go through the surgery to get that resolved, it's worth it. Why do you fix a broken bone? It's painful to fix it, but it's sure better to walk. And as you said, I've met so many people that haven't dealt with it, and they get into marriage, or they get into their profession, or they get into ministry, like as a priest or religious sister, and then it's really difficult to bring up because it's, they're in a situation where they're supposed to present love and holiness and everything else that everybody needs, and so doing it now, whenever it comes up, is really the best time to do it, even though it's really threatening.
It's interesting that you bring up they go into ministry, they go into the priesthood. Do you think sometimes people almost externalize their healing process by giving it to other people when they haven't given it to themselves? It's just like, I'm so in need of encountering God's love, of encountering God's mercy, of his healing. I'll just busy myself with trying to give that to other people to kind of live a surrogate vicarious life through other people by all the good stuff I'm doing for them, instead of sitting still and being the one to receive.
Yeah, I think so. I can relate to that because I was a therapist for a number of years before I started to deal with my own healing process. And, there's your heart knows and has compassion for the people around you, and so you naturally move to help them. But until you've dealt with it yourself, you're really not helping them. It's as we experience it for ourselves that we can help other people.
Now, you had mentioned sexual abuse. I can't even count how many young people that I've counseled have been through this stuff. And not only the girls, but the boys. Obviously the boys are a lot quieter when it comes to this stuff, because it's like, no, that's people only talk about the girls going through that stuff. So if I've gone through that, I can't disclose that. Way too much shame. How would you counsel someone, whether it's a boy or girl, that's been through sexual abuse, on the issue of trust? Because that's what I find. A lot of these young people, especially the girls, are just like, they even swear off relationships with men, of like, look, I know what's waiting for me there, and so I'm just going to shut that door, lock my heart up in a cage, in a castle, in a coffin, because if I let anybody in, I mean, it's going to get bad. I'm going to get burned, and so the only way to stay safe is to keep everybody at arm's length. How do you explain to somebody who's been through such a traumatic wound in their life to say, hey, open up again. Just put your heart out there. How do you walk somebody, through some of your counseling sessions and the healing retreats that you do? How do you restore trust again when it's been broken on such a foundational level?
Yeah, you're putting your finger right on the key thing, is the trust that's broken, and it's a betrayal wound. It's a betrayal of a fundamental sense of trust, and so there's a sense of not being safe, and so I've got to protect myself. So I think the first thing is, just as they come up to you, they see you as somebody that's trustworthy because of what you're sharing. That's already a huge risk just to share it, as you mentioned before. But that's the beginning of the work, just getting it out in the open. There's something that we call an inner vow or an inner resolution, which, whether it's conscious or not conscious, it's just a choice that says, I will not trust. I will not open myself up again. And it's an area of the will. It's an attitude of the will that's made out of that woundedness. And so when a person gets enough safety, like in a safe situation, like when you're given a conference or they come to our conference and they begin to experience the Holy Spirit, it's the Holy Spirit. Basically we bring them into that safety of the Holy Spirit that allows them then to begin to face things and deal with things. But there's also a choice of the will. There also needs to be some point, I release this. Jesus, I give you permission to bring me freedom here. I recognize this to keep me in prison, because, those walls become a prison and they shut out love and they shut out experience. And for some people that can happen fairly quickly. For some people that takes a long time, depending on the level of trauma and abuse that's there. And so we basically just help people to see it and name it, because until you name it, you really, it's just kind of operating in you and you're not recognizing it. And then we help people to recognize what it's costing them. Like what are you experiencing by not trusting, and what are you afraid of? And then we'll walk into the fear. And usually I lead people in, whether it's in a group conference or when I was counseling, I lead people in encounters with Jesus in those places. And so we'll walk back into the area where the barrier came up, where the fear came up, an abuse experience. And there's usually a lot of shame, a lot of fear, a sense of being alone. And rather than try to convince them of anything, because it's really very deep inside of them, I'll lead them in prayer experiences where they can encounter Jesus in that place of that experience. And it's what the Catechism calls contemplative meditative prayer. It's allowing those places of the hearts that have been wounded to interact with Jesus in a real way. And it's really He that unlocks the doors. Isaiah 61, I came to heal the brokenhearted. And my experience is it's when they have that encounter, things shift, things really change. Until then, it's just a lot of words. It doesn't penetrate that area where they're struggling.
Yeah, because I could only imagine that, once you've been violated in such a profound way, you doubt that you're lovable to begin with. And so instead of love being the highest value to which you try to yearn for, security and safety becomes the highest. And so that's what I need to maintain at all cost, is my security, my safety. And so I just need to stay alive at this point emotionally. And so I need to block out whatever's going to keep me from attaining security, because love, even if that exists, even if it does exist, that's for other people who might deserve it, not me. And so they cut themselves off from giving and receiving love. But what about people that the wounds were not necessarily caused by another? What about those who've had self-inflicted wounds, maybe from bad sexual choices in previous relationships before they had a conversion, and they've just done some stuff now that they regret, but they don't even know where to begin untangling that mess? How does a person who has made poor decisions begin to unravel those things, begin to make the line straight again? What would you say would be some concrete steps that person can take to realize, hey, that the future doesn't need to look like the past, and and how to forgive yourself? How would you suggest somebody move on from those things?
Yeah, I think first of all is coming to a place where they can trust to start to open it up, like they do after you give a talk. They come up and they start sharing that. That's the beginning of it. They're starting to open it up. But there's usually a lot of shame and self-condemnation. and there's also a sense of I'm too broken, it's never going to change. And those belief systems are really what's critical. The experience is in the past, but the belief systems continue in the present. And so what needs to shift is what the person believes about themselves. And so we're, again, similar way, we walk back into those areas. Like we'll go back to the beginning when it happened, and we'll just invite the Holy Spirit to show them what he wants them to see about it. What was going on, what did they experience, what do they believe about themselves. And that's really critical. So somebody, let's say, is 12 years old and they get involved in porn, and it's innocent at some level when they get exposed to it. They begin to get addicted to it. There's this, progressive movement into sexual relationships, and just the shame increases. Just this sense of shame and unworthiness and fear of being exposed. All of that, until they look at all that and recognize that there's a common thread. The common thread is both the unmet need that they're trying to get met there, and actually a holy desire that they're looking for something good. But in addition to that, there's all that shame that comes in from the disordered sexual activities. And again, it's only the Lord that can speak to somebody's heart. One thing is confession. They go to confession, that's great, but there's a deeper shame that's there. And so confession is invaluable, but I often experience that confession and a deeper kind of prayer and a sharing where you can open those places up are critical together. And so we lead people into prayer. And when Jesus speaks to somebody's heart, you're not bad, you're not dirty, or I've had people experience them just seeing themselves ashamed and naked, and Jesus comes and lifts their head and looks into their eyes, and it's a very real experience. And when that transformation happens, all of a sudden they can lift from that place where they've been stuck.
Could you speak more into that? You had mentioned about, that the person had a legitimate unmet need that was good, that they were in pursuit of, and, maybe they grabbed onto this other thing in hopes that would quench their thirst, but, maybe just the reassurance of, hey, what you wanted was good. Yeah, what you grabbed onto didn't fulfill you, but, it isn't all you're bad, you're evil, you did these stupid sexual, shameful, grave, immoral, just shame. But no, you were after something good, is just a recognition of realizing that your desires at the core had something good that they were yearning for, help them kind of forgive themselves a little bit more?
Yeah, it helps not only to forgive yourself, but to understand, oh, that's what I was looking for. Oftentimes, and you probably had this experience too, but oftentimes I'll ask people if they're into pornography, what are you looking at? What are you desiring in the pornography? I'm not justifying the looking at pornography, but I'm saying there's something you're looking for. And you find that it's very unique for each individual person. There's not one size fits all. They all go and they're looking for something very particular. And I'll say to them, okay, I understand you have a lot of shame in that area, but what is it that you're really looking for? What's the desire that you have there? And then from there, when they begin to say the desire, I can say, can you see that desire is a good desire? Did you have that desire met in your family, in your relationships? Well, no. And then they start getting into the woundedness, the areas of, okay, this is what was going on when I started to get involved in that. And all of that gives understanding. It doesn't give excuse, but it gives understanding for what they're looking for. And then I was saying, okay, so if you had a way to meet that need outside of porn, would you want that? And I haven't met anybody yet that doesn't want that. They sometimes don't believe that it's possible, but they desire the real thing because they recognize the rest of it's so artificial and just leaves them more ashamed and more cut off and more isolated.
Now, one thing that I've noticed, when I've talked to individuals who start to realize this stuff, is they tend to go to maybe one of two extremes, like one of like over spiritualizing the healing process. Well, it's just about confession and more rosaries and penances or whatever. Then other people, takes a purely humanistic approach of like, well, I'll do the counseling, I'll do the therapy, I'll do the emotional heavy lifting, but each of them only get half healed, so to speak. It's almost like they're not treating themselves in a fully human way. How do you go about trying to open somebody's eyes to the fact that, hey, your heart needs some healing and your soul does as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole foundation of our ministry is integrating those. So we start with teaching. We just start with teaching about the integration of our faith from the standpoint of healing, and that's why Jesus came. Jesus came to heal us. He came to heal our broken hearts, to set us free, to take away our shame and give us his honor and take our mourning and comfort us. And so just starting there with the truth of what the gospel is, and the gospel isn't a cover. Our religious practices aren't a cover for our healing. Our religious practices are meant to bring us into that. So even all the sacraments are intended to bring us into that healing experience with Jesus, because it's his love that's healing. It's the only thing that's healing. So somebody that goes to counseling and they're opening up, and it's totally a secular approach, if they're not guided in a particular way, they're going to get derailed and end up doing stuff that's destructive. At the same time, if somebody's just practicing their faith and not dealing with the areas of their heart and has nowhere to go, they're just covering up all the stuff that's there. And so it's the integration of those two that's really critical. And the teaching, but also the experience. I find that most of the change happens when people experience it for themselves. So that if they're sitting down, let's say with you, after a conference, and you've integrated it already, and they're sharing with you, they can't help but see that you're a person who has seen how both of those things fit together. And I think that people experience that at our conferences also. Sister Miriam quite well, and she's one of our speakers. And, when she gets up and speaks and she shares her story, just like when you guys share your story, it just draws people to a hunger. It's like, this is authentic. This is real. This is somebody who's speaking a reality of both those worlds, of both dealing with the pain and having a real spirituality. And I think that attraction then causes them to hunger it for themselves.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Now, what if somebody goes through the healing process, they do the heavy lifting, then, they didn't have the best past, then they find somebody and they're starting to look toward marriage, and then, the details start to come up about their past and they want to be honest and transparent. But the prospective partner's having a real rough time with this. I see this a lot where one person like, I waited and I thought you'd be waiting for me too. And then now we met and I think you're the one, but I don't know how to process your stuff. Like, do you ever encounter that with couples? And what kind of advice do you give them to help them to work through that as a team?
Yeah, all the time. That's also very common. I think two things. I think on both sides. I think for the one who's sharing the story, there's a lot of vulnerability in that. And it's like what they want and need is to be accepted, to have mercy come back instead of judgment. And so they're looking to feel safe enough to be able to share it. They don't want to stay in hiding. They want to be real. And so there's the person who's hearing it needs to see and hear all that this isn't about them and a statement about them. It's a statement about the shame that they've been carrying and the desire that they have for open, holy relationship, and to applaud that. On the other hand, the person who's sharing needs to recognize that the previous experiences were an infidelity to their current relationship. That there is even though it happened in the past, there's a very real betrayal at the moment that the person is being told. It's like something that was to be reserved for your spouse has in some way or another been given to somebody else. And so for the person who's sharing it not to expect that there's some trauma involved for the person receiving it is also blind. And so for each person to be able to see what the other person needs, the person who's sharing it needs to be received with love and mercy and compassion. And it's difficult if it's creating trauma in the person receiving it. And the person who's receiving it needs to experience the love and compassion of the person sharing it. This is wounding me too. Just by you sharing it, it's wounding me. And they're real wounds. They're real betrayal wounds. So both of them need to have that kind of compassion and respect for what the other one needs in that situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a real true test of love. Like, do we have the maturation to see beyond our own immediate emotional needs, to actually empathize with another human being and realize what they're going through? Because it's going to, I think, require a lot of patience on both of their parts towards the other person and what they're going through. And hey, maybe this person is going through some insecurities and some feelings of fear and betrayal, and this person's, like, hey, I don't want to be felt like my nose is getting rubbed into it, and I already got God forgave me. Why can't you forgive me? But I mean, it's okay. This gets a little bit messy, I think, but it's a real test of love. Like, and I've even told, guys that, like, look, if you can't handle her past, then you need to be honest with her about that. Like, either you go to counseling and you really find a way to work through that, because she doesn't deserve to have be hung over her head for the rest of her natural life. I mean, it's when you marry someone, you're not marrying them for their virginity. Like, you're marrying them you don't save your virginity to get it. You save it to give it. Yeah. And so when you marry somebody, and it's not like, hey, that person lost their virginity, they're totally bad, and I'm spotless. I didn't do anything bad before marriage. It's like, no, we all got our own junk, and if you don't think you have it, well, marriage will bring that up to the surface quite efficiently enough in short time. So what would you say for couples who, maybe are just individuals who came from a broken family of origin? Like, maybe the parents got divorced, maybe they didn't get divorced, but the house is full of incessant bickering or infidelity or this or that. Because a lot of people think, like, a successful marriage is one that lasts. Like, we've been married for 40 years. We have a successful marriage. Well, it could be a dumpster fire for 40 years straight. It doesn't make it successful by the duration, as much. And that's a part of the success of it. But, what's the quality of years, not so much the quantity of years. So if you've got someone who's been through a family of origin that's just been a mess, like, a lot of them just swear off marriage altogether. Of just like, forget that. Like, I know what that thing has to offer. Why would I even want to be so naive and stupid as to think that it's going to be just sunshine and roses and rainbows and lollipops and everything? So how do you speak to restore hope to somebody who's come from a broken family? I remember one saint said that you cannot build one family upon the ruins of another. And so how do you heal your family of origin when that's, in many respects, beyond your control? Like, you can't put your parents back together. You can't have a dysfunctional, relationship with siblings just fixed like that. So how do you speak to those who are coming from that, who may want to aspire to a holy marriage, but doubt that they're capable of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, that's my own experience of coming from a family where my parents divorced and there was infidelity on my father's part. And I didn't realize my need for healing until I was like in my late 20s. And then when I started to deal with it, I realized how intense it was. And like we started off with, sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with it. And there are those who don't want to get married. I remember when I was teaching, one of the students, we had a debate in the class. I was teaching in the community college, and we had somebody debating cohabitation versus marriage. And the person who was on the side of cohabitation said, my parents got divorced 3 times. I'm never going to get married. I'm not going to bring my children into that. And the person who was in the debate said, did you just hear what you said? You're not going to bring your children into an environment where they could go through a divorce, but you're going to bring your children into a situation where there's going to be one man after another because you're never going to make a commitment. And can't you see the damage that that's going to cause your children even more than the damage was caused to you? And so again, on either side of that, however we cope with it, the brokenness has to be dealt with. And it's not easy to deal with that. It's, for me, in my life, as I started to walk through it, there's a lot of intense pain. There's, it's not too different going through a divorce and experiencing sexual abuse. Because this trust that you had, this security that you had, is just ripped. there's just this rupture of trust. And the situations you talked about where there's just bickering and constant fighting and difficulty, there's no security there. There's no sense of rest. There's no sense of feeling safe and trust. And so, whether it's sexual abuse or whether it's that kind of environment, the healing process is pretty similar. They're different issues, but it's still a pretty similar process. And those deeper areas of the heart where the trust was broken, where there wasn't security, need to be addressed and restored. And again, it's a combination of people walking there, feeling safe enough to walk there, to be able to share it, to be able to grieve it, but also to encounter Jesus there in a real way, not in a just kind of a pietistic way, but in a real way of experiencing love where there wasn't love.
What does it often take for a person to get to the point where they actually come to you with this? I would imagine sometimes they're decades within their marriage, not being the mom they want to be or the dad they want to be, not being the spouse they want to be, and just being like, what the heck? Like, why am I beating my head against a wall? And I just feel like I have these good desires to build something, but I'm utterly incapable of it, and all this stuff just bubbles. Is it usually get to that point where just like, they didn't get the healing when they really needed it, shortly after the fact of all this happened or during it, but years down the road when this is just this impediment to the life that they know that they deserve? Is that usually when they finally show up at your doorstep looking for the help?
Yeah, I mean, right now we have people coming to conferences, and I'm not sure how they all get there. But as a counselor, as a therapist, there would be all kind of different situations. There would either be a crisis in their marriage that brought them there, or they have a depression, or they're struggling with anxiety. In my case, I went into therapy because I was starting to have panic, and I didn't know where it was coming from. I knew the situations, but it didn't fit. And I didn't realize that the panic that I was having, the anxiety that I was having, was related to the abandonment from my dad when he left, which was 20-some years earlier, that I had never grieved. And so, the symptoms are going to be there, but they can look really different, and they don't necessarily look like the areas that need to be healed. In that case, anxiety didn't look like abandonment, but underneath that anxiety was all that pain.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of marriages, you'd brought up pornography a little bit earlier. What about the couple in a marriage where one spouse is looking at it? Maybe perhaps with no remorse, or maybe he got caught or she got caught, and there's shame and guilt, and okay, I'll work on this fine. Like, how do you heal the wounds that porn creates in marriage? Because, I got a text recently from somebody who's counseling some couples in this area, and he said it just blows his mind how common it is that the guys are bringing this stuff into the bedroom and wanting to even watch it with the spouse to try to get in an effort to get her more interested in him. Or to get him more interested in her, of just like, hey, the flame's kind of going out, so let's bring this little spark in and let's see if we can rekindle something. Obviously there's so many different scenarios, but like, obviously it's toxic. It's cancer within marriage. It's infidelity in marriage. What do you say to perhaps to the spouse of the one who's into this stuff? Of like, how do you break through that? Like, no, like you can have your pixels or you can have your person, but you may not have both. How do you try to get through to a spouse hooked on this junk?
Yeah, the situation isn't too different than what we described of the person who's had a past and coming and sharing it in the present with the person they want to marry. It's a present day betrayal, and there is real betrayal there. Of a trust, and it's very similar. I worked for years with couples, both where one of the spouses had pornography use, or one or both of them had an adulterous relationship, and the effect is very similar. It's a trauma of betrayal, and it is different. The situation you just laid out is different. If the spouse thinks it's okay and they go along with it, they don't necessarily feel betrayed. They feel more seduced. It's like a seduction into something, and then when they discover how much damage that's caused, then the betrayal happens afterwards. Whereas the spouse that just found out that their spouse has been looking at pornography or engaging in fantasy masturbation, and it's a shock to them, then the betrayal is immediate. But in both cases, it's a betrayal wound. And Dr. Sam Fraser. Have you heard of Dr. Sam Fraser?
I don't believe so.
He talks about. I just ran across this not too long ago, but he talks about 4 denials that are involved that have to be remedied for that to be healed. He says there's a denial of the facts. So the spouse who's confronted denies that there's anything, that they're doing anything, or they deny that there's any real problem with it. That, oh, this is fine. Yeah, I'm doing this, but this is fine. Or they deny personal responsibility. Well, I'm only doing that because you're not loving me well or whatever. So they deny their personal responsibility. Or they deny the consequences. They deny that it's having any effect on themselves, on their relationship with God, on their spouse. And they said the final denial is a denial of hope. They deny that there's any possibility that anything can change. And he says both partners have all 4 of those denials that they have to work through. So the spouse who's on the receiving end of that betrayal needs to acknowledge that this is fact, this is happening. They need to get past the denial that it's happening and recognize that it's happening. They need to recognize that they're not to blame for it, that they may have responsibility for things in the relationship, but they're not the responsible one for their spouse being unfaithful. They need to look at the consequences in their own heart and in their marriage honestly and not deny it. This is really painful. I feel betrayed. I feel brought into something that feels impure to me. I feel like I can't trust you. I can't trust with you, and really deal with those things. And then in dealing with those things, having hope that things can be restored. And I have watched, when I was a therapist, I watched couples go through situations like that, and it's usually a 2-year hellish process. The one spouse says, well, I've asked for forgiveness, why don't you forgive me? And the spouse says, well, I have forgiven you, but we haven't dealt with any of the pain and the mistrust and the reconciliation that needs to happen here. That's what takes 2 years, even if they come clean and take those 4 areas of responsibility. Then the process of healing the trust. But I've watched over and over again couples come back after adultery or after pornography, and they've really worked through it together. They said our marriage is better than it ever was. We are grateful that we had to go through this. We actually know how to love each other. Before we were just lusting each other. We know how to love each other now. We've had to walk through the hard places and see the ugliness in ourselves and in each other and love each other for the beauty of who we are. And that's the hope.
No, that's great stuff. Now, for the man who, or the woman who realize, okay, fine, I'm going to get over my denial. What I'm doing is wrong. What I'm doing is hurtful. Maybe there is hope. That addiction's there. That hooks. I mean, maybe that guy been hooked on it since he was 12, and now he's 42. And, his 12-year-old daughter just found it on his laptop and told mom, and all hell's breaking loose. And, as much shame and guilt as he may feel, like he still feels enslaved to this stuff. How do you help someone break free from that porn addiction? Whether they're 18 years old and realize they've gotten in too deep and, like, oh my goodness, I shouldn't be looking at this stuff. And they're just at the starting stages of that addiction, or someone who's had a full blown, bondage to this stuff for decades. What steps do you recommend, whether it's a male or female take, I don't know how different the steps may be, to break free from that addiction and find freedom once they desire it?
Okay. So first is those 4 denials. They have to walk through those things so that they're facing it. Then the second is kind of what we talked about before with the young person who's bound up in that. It's not dissimilar. They have to find some places where they're safe, where they're not going to be condemned, where they're not going to be shamed, where they're safe to be able to share what they're going through and be understood. And then those layers that we talked about. I'll walk somebody through and I'll say, okay, here's what happened. Let's go back and look at when it started, how it started, why it started, what were you looking for, and so what's the holy desire? And when we start doing that, it seems to break through the shame. It's like, okay, there's some good in me. This isn't all that I'm just totally evil and dirty and perverted. There's some good. that I'm looking for? Where are the unmet needs currently in your relationship? Where are you not getting those needs met? And look in your childhood when you started that. What was going on? What were the circumstances? And what we find is a lot of woundedness there. That's where some of that broken family situation, parents are fighting all the time, or, there's a divorce, or I got rejected by 3 girls in my class or 3 guys in my class. And so they're looking to the pornography as a way to meet a need out of a woundedness. And so we have to go back and walk into the woundedness. And in the woundedness, we find out that there's always a hidden pattern of sin. I think you mentioned to me before this about Jay Stringer. And Jay Stringer, in his book Unwanted, talks about this a lot. He says, before lust, there's always a broken relationship. So what are the broken relationships? And where are the areas of hurt, anger, bitterness, resentment, judgment that are all underlying the lust? And my experience is when people will go through all of those different phases and bring those into relationship with Jesus in a real way and allow him to meet them in each of those 5 places for forgiveness, for healing, for the love needs in community, bringing into community. I'm not talking about Jesus just in isolation, but in the body of Christ. And then they can see that the desires are being redeemed and restored. Sometimes it's a support group, sometimes it's a counselor, sometimes it's a spiritual director, sometimes it's all of those. But I understand you guys are working on a good project also. And so I'm anxious. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm anxious to see what that is. Tell me a little bit about that, because I bet you that's part of the answer.
Yeah, no, we've got a couple things going on. One is we're going to launch something called the Missionaries of Chastity. And what that is typically when we write a book, or give a speech, we'll talk to the kids, hand them a book, good luck. And maybe they'll connect to us through the website or whatever. But people have always asked us, like, well, what's the follow-up here? What's going to happen after the fact? And I'm like, well, we're doing podcasts, we're doing YouTube, but there's been a disconnect in terms of, like, how do we bring all the things together? And so recently, Matt, Fred, and I got one here, wrote the book called Forged for guys on how to break free from porn. And this is the first time we kind of turned a product into something interactive, where on day 1, we tell the guys, hey, text the word forged, the number 66866, and every day for 33 days, you're going to get a video from a different presenter on how to break free and find healing and all this stuff. And so every day of the book, we're walking with them as a journey for 33 days. And now we're encountering them, not just on the pages of a book, we're encountering them on the place that they potentially are falling. Now we're in their phones, we're on the YouTube, we're all on that stuff. And so we thought, well, wait a minute, we could do this with every single product. So like if someone gets a copy of my wife's book, Made New, on how to heal from sexual abuse, page 1, let's just put a piece of paper there that says, hey, text this to that or scan this code. And then we're going to send you a video for the next 6 days of just Kristalina walking with you on how to begin this whole healing process. Well, the girls dive into that, but then this is almost like the top of the funnel, but now we give them, several days of formation in every area they want. And then the last email or video we would send them is an invitation to spread this whole message, where we're going to tell them, like, hey, now you've heard it. We want you to launch a project, meaning, hey, who do you want to share this message with? Do you want to give away these books to the girls at your high school? Well, what about reaching the guys at the all-boys high school down the street, or the CCD class, or the retreat, or let's reach parents. Let's, reach the crisis pregnancy centers. Give them some free resources. Like, what's your project? Let us know what it is, and we're going to launch a project with you. We'll create your own page on our website that hosts it like a GoFundMe page. And then everybody, we'll drive traffic there. You drive traffic there. We'll raise the funds to send all this stuff out and launch a project. And that will end up dumping all the more resources to the top of the funnel to create a whole new cyclical pattern of growth in the ministry. And once you launch a project, you become what we call a missionary of chastity. And we're going to send you some free swag and have exclusive, events for you and formation, things like that. But then also you can launch more projects and more. And so it's kind of a cyclical thing that we're not just giving somebody a product, we're giving them a project. We're not just giving them a resource, we're giving them an apostolate. We're giving them a mission. And I've found all over the world, there's so many people that are just ready to go. Like we almost kind of need to be the arms dealers, that we've got the militia on the ground, but they're not equipped. They got like shovels and pitchforks, but like, hey, if we can give those guys some, automatic rifles and some bazookas and whatever, they're going to do some amazing things in the church. And so that's what we want to do, is just supply people with this and equip them and show them how to launch these things, and then let them get to work. Because I think there's so many apostles like this globally that are just ready to go and spread the message. So that's kind of the big reveal of what we announced this last week. And so we're trying to raise funds right now. People can donate at chastity.com/donate. And then we're going to build a whole new website around this, and then hopefully launch it by May. So that's the big plan.
I heard that earlier this week. That's part of the reason why we're doing this. And I was so inspired by that, because that's the problem we all run into. We go do conferences, we have resources, we have books, and they're all good and they're all important. But how do we do the work afterwards and help engage people in the work, which is what the call is. And so when I heard that, it was just very inspiring to me.
Yeah, so we're super excited about the direction it's going to go in, because, we can give all this stuff out and like, hey, I wish you the best, but then it just kind of falls off. But like, what if we could bring people into the funnel up from one of these healing books and then point them over to your ministry of like, okay, now you read the book, now you got to go experience this stuff in person. Because it's, like we're talking about pornography. Like, let's say a person goes through, okay, I broke the addiction, I'm not looking at it anymore, I'm doing better. How do you not only heal the addiction, what type of tips do you think you would give someone on on how to heal from the effects of it afterwards? Because like, let's say they use their Covenant Eyes app, and all that stuff, which is great. They've got the filters, they've got the accountability, they've achieved sobriety for several months. But it's almost like you drive a nail into a piece of wood. Like, you can pull the nail out, but like, you got a divot there, like you got a hole. What types of things would you recommend for someone to follow up on how to heal from the effects of porn in their own personal life, of like how they view other human beings and just in general? How would you recommend somebody heal from that addiction once the addiction itself has been addressed?
Yeah, great question. A lot of our resources are towards that. So for example, we have a Holy Desire. It's a series of talks and then a workbook. And we're basically leading people through a process of healing as they walk through the workbook. And so we sometimes have groups do those together. And so that there's a group with somebody who's had some experience who's facilitating. And then the group of people will walk together and share the journey together, or the Healing the Whole Person material, or, the Undone Women's material, or the men's, just whatever the particular area is around the different books, Be Healed, the marriage with unveiled marriage stuff. But the whole purpose of our ministry is to give resources that people can walk through together or individually in that process, and then try to plug them in with resources where they can do that.
And can you remind the people watching or listening right now, where do they go to find these resources? The books, the programs, the curricula? How do those things work? Can they go to retreats at your place? Where should somebody go to connect with you?
Yeah, it's John Paul II Healing Center, so it's jpiihealingcenter.org. And, the resources are all listed up in our store. And conferences are listed on the front page. Also, in the different communities, we usually, as we've been going around the country, we've kind of formed teams in those areas. So if people are in a particular area, they can maybe get plugged into stuff that's already going on in that city. Also, our podcast, Restore the Glory podcast, restoretheglory.com. And Jake Kim, who's a therapist up in Canada, Catholic therapist, and I just kind of walk people through these healing processes and apply it in everyday life on the podcast.
That's fantastic. Now, before we let you go, I do have two questions from some of our patrons that ask you real specific questions, and I want to toss those to you before I let you go. Patron number one question said, Doctor, what about emotional affairs where there's no physical intimacy, but more emotional connection and spiritual connection? When does a spiritual friendship cross a line into an affair?
Yeah, when it crosses the line is a good question, but anytime there's a replacement, anytime a spouse is looking to another person besides their spouse in an intimacy, where the intimacy now has gotten transferred over. It's an emotional affair and it's crossed the line. And sometimes that's hard to see when that line gets crossed, because there's just a friendship and there's an easy sharing. But I think the person in their heart begins to know, because they begin to hide the relationship, they begin to hide and rationalize what they're feeling. Again, I heard somebody else share about kind of the process that goes on is you start wanting to spend time with the person in the presence of others, and then you want to start spending time one-on-one without your spouse being around or their spouse being around or somebody else. When that starts to happen, a boundary has been crossed. There are some situations where you can have male-female relationships that are public, that aren't intimate in that way. But once that friendship begins to be exclusive and there begins to be a level of sharing, that's the beware point. And once it gets past that point, then it can turn into, long hugs, kisses, and you just rationalize to yourself that these are all platonic. And there's no intention that there's going to be a sexual affair, but there's already an emotional affair going on. And you find yourself thinking about that other person rather than thinking about your spouse. You find yourself sharing things with that person that you wouldn't share with your spouse. And it's what's called a second-class adultery. There's direct adultery, and then there's an adultery of the heart. And it's a betrayal wound also. That we need to take that more seriously, because there's a real betrayal that happens. And like the other areas, there is a wounding and a pattern of sin that's happened way back before that, where the alienation has started to happen in the marriage. And that's what really needs to get attended to, is where did the division start to happen in the marriage, that another person starts to fill that on either side.
Two questions I popped to mind as you said. How does this apply to dating couples? Because I got a lot of couples will, contact me and be like, well, my boyfriend doesn't ever want me to speak to another male. And if he ever sees me even talking to somebody, he gets super upset, which could be a control issue. Whereas other ones, like, is it even possible to have friends of the opposite sex while you're currently dating somebody? Like, where's the line there? Any guiding principles that you could give to those couples?
Yeah. And again, it's without knowing the specific circumstances, it's hard to be specific, but you've identified the two sides of it. One is there's a controlling boyfriend who doesn't want the person to talk to or see anybody else because they're so threatened. And that's their own woundedness. That's their own experiences of hurt and betrayal and insecurity that they have to deal with. But there are I've heard somebody, a girlfriend who wanted to be able to see her old boyfriend and go over to his house. And the boyfriend said, no, that's not okay. And then the girlfriend gets upset. You're trying to control me. No, that's not control. That's saying, that's crossing over a boundary. That's inappropriate for you to go spend time intimately with an old boyfriend when you're my boyfriend. And so it's just seeing where there's violation of proper boundaries. And I find in a lot of this generation, there hasn't been a clarity of boundaries. And so people don't know what healthy boundaries are. It's just like anything goes, and it leads to a lot of unhealthy situations that, my experience is, if you have a friendship, male-female friendship, you can tell when that friendship is in the realm of, this isn't a threat to my relationship at all, to where the boyfriend's threatened or the girlfriend's threatened by it, and you begin to notice that your intimacy and your attraction is different than it is with your boyfriend or girlfriend. And that's the beware point. Sometimes you have an old friend and you're just so close and you share more than you do with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and that's a danger point. It needs to transfer. The allegiance needs to transfer.
Do you think sometimes you can have a form of an affair with a member of the same sex within a marriage with no sexual attraction. What I mean by this is like emotionally, you're not getting my needs met, so I'm going to go get super connected to my parents, get super connected to my girlfriend, or my friend over here, and I'm going to go outside of the sacrament for my emotional needs because just you're not getting it done. Whereas maybe a woman is doing that with her friends and family, whether the guy's doing that of just like, hey, I'm out of here. I got poker night for the fourth night in a row, where it's not, in a sexual type of thing, but there's almost an infidelity of the emotional rights of intimacy that should be exchanged. And obviously there's some understandable circumstances under that of just like, well, I'm a wife and my husband is completely self-absorbed, doesn't listen to anything I say, gets bored after 2 words out of my mouth, and I need some human connection. But maybe you could speak to that experiences where some people have just kind of sworn off like, hey, I'm not going to get it from you, so I got to go get it, find it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of wisdom, is that we can turn anything into an affair that takes the place of our loyalty to our spouse. And there are some very real situations where there's nothing happening here, and the spouse isn't willing to deal with it. And so you're left in this conundrum of what do I do? But as soon as you start looking out here to get that fulfillment, you've become part of the problem rather than part of the remedy. And I have a lot of compassion for a spouse in that situation, but even a therapist can become, or a spiritual director, or a best friend, or a work project can become a source of infidelity, because it's taking out of the dedication and the energy to loving the spouse. And one of the things that nobody can ever stop us from doing is giving love to somebody else. And so even if you're not receiving love, and it's difficult, you have to have a strong prayer life and a good support community, but we can always be giving love. And I think we all know when we begin to close our heart off in resentment or anger or hopelessness and start looking out here, I think we know that internally, at least there's signs of it, there's symptoms of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Now, one last question before I let you go from one of our patrons. Dr. Bob, I'll be coming into the church this Easter, but the rest of my family is all Protestant. The only substantial obstacle I'm running into in getting them on board with Catholic teaching is the topic of divorce and remarriage. Many of my family members have had multiple marriages, and no matter how patiently and lovingly I discuss the church's teachings on marriage and divorce, they tend to respond with hostility. The fact that they have a disproportionate emotional response to the topic makes me think that they do feel convicted about having multiple marriages, and the response is more them fighting their own convictions than them fighting me. So my question is, what can I do to help them spiritually and emotionally while the Lord works in them? Piece of cake.
They're all great questions, but not easy ones. So I think, first of all, I think the recognition of what the person's asking is, there's obviously something's coming up in terms of their own shame, their own self-condemnation, their own conviction on the part of the family members. And so the first thing I would ask, and it sounds like the person sounds like they're being compassionate, but the first thing I would ask is, are they feeling judged at all by you as you talk about the church's teachings? Is there any sense in which, even in that conversation, they're feeling like you're judging them? Or is it all internal, and you're coming from a place of respect and acceptance and mercy, and they're just feeling it internally? In either case, it's recognizing that the issue is no longer about the church. The issue is about that shame or that conviction or that guilt or that feeling of being judged. And so that's what needs to be addressed. And one of the ways of addressing it is with the church teaching that there's always hope. Again, I use the experience with my parents, and my father and mom divorced. My dad got remarried outside of the church, left the church for 25 years, got divorced again, and ended up meeting a woman and going through a process and getting annulment of the 2 previous relationships, which wasn't permission for the divorces. It was a recognition of his immaturity and the basis of his sexual compulsion that had influenced those other marriages, and his alcoholism. And when he had a place of hope that the church could help heal these past situations, he celebrated the church's teachings rather than feared the church's teaching. But we have a lot of people, even in the church, who end up leaving the church because they live in condemnation. Well, I've been divorced, I can't have communion, I can't, I've been remarried. And, the church is always wanting to speak the truth in love. So it's, what's the hope that we can give to a couple like that? And, I think it's gotten, it's created a lot of stir, but I think the good part of what Pope Francis is trying to address in that issue with what do we do with divorced couples, it's crossed over a line in terms of the discussion, but is we need to be welcoming to all couples and all people as a church without in any way lessening. And I would say, finally to this person's relatives, it's not about what the church teaches, it's about what Jesus taught. And the church is just upholding what Jesus taught. So I would go back to Scripture. If they're a Christian, Protestant Christian, they may interpret the Scripture differently, but you're just presenting them the truth of what the Scripture says. But always from a standpoint of mercy, always from the standpoint of hope. Where is the hope for them if they were to embrace this truth? How could, and one of the hopes for them is that they probably didn't know the truth. They probably got married outside of the Catholic Church if they're Protestant. And so their marriages could be restored in the church to be a sacramental marriage, possibly at this point. So always bringing them that hope.
Yeah, one thing I think it's good to keep in mind is how the apostles themselves reacted to this teaching when Jesus dropped that bomb on them. Like, hey, is it permissible just to give, Moses gave a bill of divorce, can we just do that? And Jesus says, And their reaction is priceless. They actually say, well, then it's better than not to get married if you can't. But it's like, wait a minute, what did you say? They actually said, what's the point of getting married if you can't get divorced? Like, it is expedient not to get married then if I can't even get a divorce. I mean, it just shows you the hardness of the hearts of the very foundation of the Catholic Church. And like, maybe if they went back to the Scripture, they'd realize, hey, the apostles, the saints themselves said, hey, this is a hard saying. Like, this is really tough. But I think the key that I think helped the apostles swallow this whole thing is that they had that living relationship with him. They could trust him on this one. And if you got a relative who's on his third marriage, and the marriage he's in now, he's relatively happy with, and they've had 3 kids together, the idea of just like going with the church is like, it's like telling me, okay, well, Jason, why don't you take all your bookshelves here, all your books and all your family pictures and just turn it upside down, okay? And it's like, no, that's going to ruin everything. It's all going to fall out. Everything's going to smash on the floor. We're just going to leave it where it is because I can't see any way of upending my life and that not turning my whole life into just a complete mess. But to me, the whole key that would unlock, how could God get this mess where I've built myself into? Because we put ourselves in these corners, and then we kind of blame him for all his rules. We put ourselves in the corner. I think God knows the way out of all these circumstances. And if we trust him, he's the only one that can untangle the knots that we've tied ourselves into. And so it's that personal relationship with him that would give you the ability to trust God enough to be like, okay, well, here's my situation. Here's what I built for myself with a couple kids from different wives. And, if I went with the church, then what does that mean? I'm going to have to divorce her or be celibate with her. Like just the very fear of facing that makes people not even want to take the first step on the journey. But it's like, if we have a good God who trusts us, who loves us, and is able to figure this stuff out, if we can trust him like the apostles can, then he'll be able to iron that stuff out no matter how daunting the task may be. And who knows, in the end, odds are God can actually give you a future much greater through his gift of mercy than you could ever have grasped on by your own impatience and distrust. But yeah, I would say just keep loving your families and, encourage them to reread the Scriptures and why this, the saints struggle with that as well. So you've got some more thoughts on it too.
I'm thinking of 2 couples that I counseled who were Protestants when they started, and they were in that situation, and they were drawn to the church, but that was the major obstacle of why they didn't want to enter into the church. And exactly what you just said, I just watched them as they slowly surrendered it to Jesus and walked with him in that. the beauty in both of those cases of how he brought them into the church, and he brought healing and restoration in those areas that there was no way out for them. They just couldn't see a way.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome. Well, it's a good note of hope to end on. And so, Dr. Bob, again, thank you so much for coming on with us today. And I want to just make sure everybody checks out the website that's already in the link of the show notes. If you're watching on Facebook, I've already posted there. You click to more, find out about his work. Also, if you want to support us on Patreon, please do. Just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert. That helps support our family and our ministry to keep growing and spreading this message. And then lastly, again, a reminder, if you want to go on us with pilgrimage to the Holy Land or to Krakow, we've got those pilgrimages coming up in May and in August. And so we would love to spend those time with you overseas and just getting a break away from it all. But again, Dr. Bob, thank you for coming on the show. God bless you, your family, and the important work that you're doing.
Thank you, Jason. It's been great being with you, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.